They told me it was all in my head, an imaginary buddy to chalk up to childhood. So when I described him down to the crooked smile and the scar behind his ear, my mom went white as a sheet and whispered a name she hadn't said in years. What she did next is the kind of thing you only see in movies, and it changed everything. Stick around, this one gets dark fast. They said he was an imaginary friend. Then my mom whispered a name, and a whole world tilted on its axis. I promise you, by the end of this, you'll see the secret she was hiding, the proof I found, and a twist that changes not just what I thought about my childhood, but what I thought about her. Have you ever said something so simple, so innocent, and watched an entire room go silent, like you just pulled the pin on a grenade? I have. After that conversation, my mom went to my bedroom closet, the one with the sticky door that never quite shut right, and she locked it from the outside with a key I'd never seen before. She looked at me, her eyes dark and serious, and she told me never, ever to open it. Our street was the kind of place where summer meant the constant hum of cicadas and the smell of cut grass. We were a neighborhood of bare feet on hot pavement, of dirt bikes leaving skids on the sidewalk, and of sprinklers clicking back and forth in the afternoon heat. I was 6 years old, and my world was the size of our backyard, a kingdom ruled by a giant oak tree whose branches scraped against my bedroom window on windy nights. The smell of oil from my dad's old Ford truck hung in the garage, a scent that for me was the smell of safety, of him being home. My mom's laugh was a constant soundtrack to those days, but even then, I think some part of me knew it didn't always reach her eyes. There was a thinness to it, like a melody played one note too high. That was the summer I met Eli, or at least that's the name I gave him. He was just there one afternoon. I was digging for worms near the roots of the oak tree, and when I looked up, he was sitting on the lowest branch watching me. He didn't look like a kid. He seemed older, not in a grown-up way, but in a way that felt like he'd been sitting there for 100 summers. He wasn't scary. He was quiet. He'd tell me things, strange things, that a 6-year-old wouldn't have any reason to make up. He knew the names of people who'd lived on our street before we did. He'd talk about years like 1987 as if it were last week. He'd point to the house across the street and say, "Mrs. Gable used to plant tulips right there, but her dog always dug them up." I'd ask my mom about it later, and she'd just shake her head and say, "Mrs. Gable moved away before I was even born." He never played with me, not really. He just sat and talked. He had a voice that sounded like gravel rolling around in a can, low and a little rough. He'd tell me small details about people, things you couldn't guess. He knew that my dad's favorite coffee mug had a tiny chip on the rim that he always turned away from his mouth. He knew that my mom hummed when she was worried, a tune so low you could barely hear it. It was comforting, in a way. It felt like having a secret, a friend who knew all the other secrets. But then, one day, it stopped feeling like a game. I was sitting on the porch swing, and my mom was inside, whistling a song while she did the dishes. Eli was sitting on the railing, balancing perfectly. He tilted his head, and in that gravelly voice, he said, "Your mom used to whistle that same song when she was 17, sitting on this very porch." The world stopped. It wasn't the kind of thing a kid invents. It wasn't a monster or a superhero. It was a detail, a tiny, specific, impossible detail. I went inside, my bare feet smacking against the linoleum floor. My mom turned from the sink, wiping her hands on a dish towel. I asked her, "Did you whistle that song when you were a teenager?" She smiled, but it was that smile again, the one that didn't have any real warmth behind it. What a funny question. Kids make up the silliest things. She turned back to the sink, her shoulders a little tighter than they were before. She changed the subject, asked if I wanted a popsicle. But I saw her reflection in the window above the sink. Her eyes were closed, just for a second, and her hand was pressed flat against the counter, like she was holding on to keep from falling. Who taught a ghost grown-up memories? And why did my mom look so scared when I asked? Did you ever have an imaginary friend who knew too much? Someone who said things they had no business knowing? Tell me about it in the comments below. I need to know I'm not the only one. The popsicle trick worked for a little while. Kids have short attention spans, but the feeling didn't go away. It was like a splinter in my mind, this sense that Eli wasn't just a product of an overactive imagination. I started trying to prove he was real, not just to my parents, but to myself. I started describing him to anyone who would listen, mostly just my mom. I told her he was tall, taller than my dad, but skinny. I told her about his smile, how one side of his mouth lifted up more than the other, a crooked, gentle kind of smile. I told her about his hands, how they always looked cold, even in the middle of July. And I told her about the scar. It was a thin, white line tucked just behind his right ear, disappearing into his hairline. He'd told me he got it from a piece of scrap metal when he was building a treehouse that used to stand right where our oak tree was. I wasn't making it up. The details were too clear, too solid in my head. They weren't toddler nonsense, like a purple monster with 6 arms. This was a person, a real person. The neighbors started to notice. I'd be in the front yard, sitting on the grass, having a full-blown conversation with the empty space next to me. Mrs. Henderson from next door would wave at my mom over the fence with a look that was halfway between amusement and concern. My mom would just smile back, that tight, thin smile, and call me inside. The house started to feel smaller, the walls closing in. The subject of Eli became a forbidden topic, a name that made the air in a room feel thick and heavy. Then came the morning that broke everything open. We were at the breakfast table. My dad was reading the paper, my mom was pouring sugar into her coffee, and I was pushing Cheerios around in my milk. I don't know why I said it then. Maybe I was just tired of being told I was making it up. I blurted it out, my voice too loud in the quiet kitchen. Eli has a scar behind his ear, just like this. I traced a line behind my own ear with my finger. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the soft clink of the sugar spoon against the ceramic mug. My mom froze. Her hand was hovering over the coffee cup, sugar still trickling from the spoon. Her eyes were locked on me, wide and unblinking. She didn't look confused or annoyed. She looked terrified. Her hand started to tremble, just a little at first, then more violently. A small pile of sugar spilled onto the table. She slowly, deliberately put the sugar spoon down. The clatter it made sounded like a gunshot in the silence. My dad lowered his newspaper, a frown creasing his forehead. He opened his mouth to say something, probably to tell me to stop with the stories, but my mom spoke first. Her voice was a whisper, a dry, cracking sound that barely carried across the table. She wasn't looking at me anymore. She was looking through me, at something far away. "Daniel," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a name I had never, ever heard before. She looked at me, her face ashen, and her voice was shaking when she asked, "Where did you hear that name? What would you do if a kid in your house started naming people you thought were gone forever? Let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious." That one word, Daniel, changed everything. It was like she'd flipped a switch, plunging our quiet, normal house into a strange, dark place I didn't recognize. Her reaction wasn't just shock. It was something deeper, something visceral. She pushed her chair back from the table, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. She didn't say another word. She just walked out of the kitchen, her movements stiff and jerky, like a puppet on strings. A minute later, we heard the click of the bathroom door locking. My dad folded his newspaper with slow, deliberate movements. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just said, "Eat your breakfast," his voice flat and empty. But the command had no authority. We both knew something had just broken, something important. The silence that followed was worse than any shouting match could have been. I could hear the faint sound of my mom crying in the bathroom, small, choked-off sobs. Later, I heard her on the phone in her bedroom. her voice so low I couldn't make out the words, just the urgent, frantic tone. She was whispering, like she didn't want the walls to hear. The mood in the house shifted permanently after that morning. Dinners were eaten in near silence. My parents spoke to each other in short, clipped sentences about bills and groceries, skirting around the giant, invisible thing that was now sitting at the table with us. The laughter, even the thin, brittle kind my mom used to have, was gone completely. A few days later, I was playing in the living room, and I heard my mom on the phone again. This time, I crept closer to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. Her voice was strained, desperate, and I heard her say the name again, but this time it was the name I had given him. "He knows about the scar," she whispered into the receiver. "He calls him Eli. How could he possibly know?" She said the name Eli as if it was a curse. It was an old name, a name that didn't belong to any of the kids at my school or on our street. It couldn't possibly belong to someone I knew. And yet, she had said it. She had confirmed it. Eli wasn't just in my head. He was in hers too. After she hung up, she came out of the bedroom. She didn't seem to notice me sitting on the floor. Her eyes were distant, focused on something I couldn't see. She walked straight to the hall closet, pulled down the string for the attic stairs, and climbed up without a word. I heard her moving around up there, the sound of boxes being shifted, the floorboards groaning under her weight. A few minutes later, she came back down, clutching a dusty shoebox to her chest. It was just a plain brown cardboard box, the kind shoes came in from a department store, but she held it like it contained something fragile and dangerous. She saw me watching her, and her face hardened. "Go play outside," she said, her voice sharp. She didn't wait for me to move. She turned, walked back to the attic stairs, and slammed the heavy wooden door shut. The sound echoed through the quiet house. What was in that shoebox? And why was she so desperate to keep it hidden from me? Have you ever had a grown-up in your life act like they were hiding a skeleton in the closet? What did you do? I feel like I need some advice, even all these years later. I waited until I was sure she was busy, until I heard the sound of the vacuum cleaner starting up downstairs. The attic was forbidden territory, a place of dusty Christmas decorations and old, forgotten furniture. But the image of that shoebox was burned into my mind. I had to know what was inside. I tiptoed to the hall closet and pulled the string. The stairs unfolded with a loud, groaning complaint. I held my breath, listening for the vacuum to stop, but it kept humming along. I scrambled up the steps into the hot, stuffy darkness. The air was thick with the smell of cedar, mothballs, and old caper. A single bare bulb cast long, distorted shadows across stacks of boxes and furniture draped in white sheets, making them look like a gathering of ghosts. I knew where she'd been. There was a space cleared on the floor in the far corner, a small circle of dust-free wood. The shoebox was there, tucked behind an old moth-eaten blanket. My heart was pounding in my chest as I reached for it. The lid wasn't taped down. I lifted it off carefully. Inside, it didn't look like much at first. There was a small stack of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. There was a little toy car, a red convertible, with a long, deep scrape down the side of the passenger door. And underneath it all, there was a single Polaroid photograph. I picked it up. The colors were faded, washed out with age. It showed a young man, probably not much older than a teenager, standing in our backyard. He was leaning against a tree, but it wasn't the giant oak I knew. It was a smaller, younger version of it. He was wearing jeans and a plain white t-shirt. And he was smiling at the camera. It was a crooked smile, with one side of his mouth pulling up more than the other. I could almost feel the breath leave my body. It was him. It was Eli. I turned the photo over. On the back, written in my mom's loopy, familiar cursive, was a single word: Daniel. I stared at the name, the same one she had whispered at the breakfast table. So Eli was Daniel, a real person. I felt a strange mix of vindication and dread. I wasn't crazy. But if I wasn't crazy, then something was very, very wrong. I looked closer at the photo. In the bottom corner, there was a date, printed in that classic Polaroid font. It was from 15 years before I was born. But that wasn't the part that made my blood run cold. My mom had always told me she grew up in a different state, that she'd moved here right after she married my dad and never looked back. But the date on the photo was years after she swore she had left that old life behind. Why was he here, in this yard, when she was supposed to be 1,000 miles away? And then I saw it. Just at the edge of the frame, almost completely cut off, was a hand. It was reaching into the shot, its fingers slightly curled as if it was about to touch his arm. But that was all you could see. Someone else was there, someone the camera had tried to forget. Does finding an old photo ever feel like opening a time capsule? Or does it sometimes feel like you've just sprung a trap? Let me know what you think. The Polaroid felt hot in my hand, like it was a piece of evidence from a crime scene. I carefully put everything back in the shoebox, tucked it away behind the blanket, and crept back downstairs. The house felt different now, charged with a secret I was now a part of. I couldn't ask my mom. I knew she would just lie, or worse, get that cold, distant look in her eyes again. I needed someone who wasn't part of the lie. I needed a memory that wasn't mine. That's when I thought of Mrs. Lopez. She lived 2 doors down, in a little yellow house with a garden full of rose bushes. She'd lived on this street her entire life, since long before my parents ever moved in. She was the neighborhood's unofficial historian, a woman whose memory was as sharp as the thorns on her prize-winning roses. I found her on her front porch, snipping dead leaves off a geranium plant. I started by asking her about the oak tree, if she remembered when it was small. That was all it took. Her eyes lit up and the stories started to flow. She talked about the families who had come and gone, the block parties in the 70s, the big snowstorm of '82. I held my breath, waiting for the right moment. Then I asked her if she remembered a boy, a teenager who used to live in our house a long, long time ago. She paused, her gardening shears held mid-snip. She looked over at my house, her gaze lingering on the yard. "Oh, yes," she said, her voice softening. "I remember Daniel. Such a quiet boy. A little sad, I always thought." She told me stories about him, how he used to play in the yard by himself, always tinkering with something, an old or a model airplane. She mentioned there had been some kind of trouble, an accident years ago that people whispered about but never discussed openly. She said she used to hear arguments coming from the house, hushed, angry voices late at night that would get cut off if a window was open. Then she leaned in a little closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She told me a rumor, one that had circulated around the neighborhood after he was gone, that he had disappeared after a terrible fight with someone. Someone, she said, who'd much rather forget he ever existed at all. My throat felt tight. I was about to ask more when she looked at the big oak tree, a real memory surfacing in her eyes. "I remember the day he did that," she said, pointing with her shears. "He spent a whole afternoon out there with a pocket knife, carving something into the trunk." She said she remembered him carving initials into the bark, right near the base. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Eli, Daniel, had told me a story once about a little wooden bird he'd carved for a girl he knew. He'd carved her initials into it, right next to his. He told me my name was pretty because it started with the same letter as hers. And then Mrs. Lopez said something that made the ground feel like it was falling out from under me. She said she remembered seeing him bury something, a little metal box, right by the roots of that tree, the very night he vanished. Her eyes met mine, and they were full of a strange, old sadness. "I always wondered what was in it," she said softly. "You'll find it if you're brave enough to look." Have you ever dug up a rumor and wished you hadn't? Tell me the wildest neighborhood rumor you've ever heard. I'm starting to think they're not all just stories. I wasn't brave enough to go alone. The sun was setting, casting long, spooky shadows across the lawn, and the idea of digging under that tree felt like disturbing a grave. I went and got Tommy, my best friend from down the street. He was the kind of kid who was always up for an adventure, especially one that felt forbidden. I told him the whole story: Eli, the photo, what Mrs. Lopez had said. He didn't even hesitate. He just grabbed a small shovel from his garage and said, "Let's go." We went back to the oak tree as dusk settled over the neighborhood, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple. The air was getting cooler, and the chirping of crickets was starting to replace the daytime sounds of the street. Tommy started to dig where Mrs. Lopez had suggested, right near a gnarled old root that snaked out of the ground. The dirt was damp and sticky, smelling of old rain and decaying leaves. The shovel made a soft, rhythmic scraping sound as it cut into the earth. For a while, we found nothing but rocks and worms. I was starting to think Mrs. Lopez had been mistaken, or maybe the memory had gotten fuzzy over the years. But then, the shovel hit something with a dull, metallic thud. Tommy dropped to his knees and started clearing the dirt away with his hands. It was a tin box, rusted around the edges, the kind that used to hold fancy cookies or tea. It was heavier than it looked. We carried it over to the porch light, my hands shaking so much I could barely get the lid open. It creaked in protest, flaking rust onto my fingers. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried leaves, were two things. The first was an old-fashioned locket on a delicate silver chain. It was tarnished with age, but I could still see the intricate floral pattern etched onto the front. I pried it open. On one side was a tiny, perfectly cut-out picture of my mom. She looked so young, no older than 16, her hair long and her smile genuine, not like the one she wore now. On the other side, carved carefully into the back of the locket, was a small, jagged symbol like a lightning bolt. The same scar mark symbol Eli had described to me from his treehouse accident. The second thing in the box was a scrap of paper, a single page torn from a notebook, folded into a tiny square. The handwriting was messy, slanted, the same handwriting as the name on the back of the Polaroid. It was a note, but it seemed to stop mid-thought. It read, "I know you're scared. I am too. But we can't keep living like this. Meet me at the tree when you can get away. If you read this, forgive me. I had to leave." That's where it ended. No name, no explanation. Just those final haunting words. Who wrote the note? And why did they have to leave so suddenly that they couldn't even finish it? Would you keep digging when every single clue points to more trouble? Or would you just walk away? Be honest. I need to know what you would have done. I walked back into my house that night feeling like a trespasser in my own life. The locket was heavy in my pocket, a cold, solid piece of a past I was never supposed to know about. Tommy had gone home, promising to keep quiet. Now it was just me, the silent house, and the evidence I couldn't ignore. I found my parents in the living room, watching TV. The flickering blue light cast shadows on their faces, making them look like strangers. I didn't say anything. I just walked over to the coffee table, right in front of the television, and placed the Polaroid, the locket, and the crumpled note down on the wood. The sound of the sitcom on the TV seemed to fade away. The air became thick, unbreathable. My dad looked from the items on the table to my face, his jaw tight. My mom just stared at the locket, her hand flying to her mouth. A small, wounded sound escaped her lips. And then she broke. It wasn't a loud, dramatic breakdown. It was a quiet, complete collapse. The carefully constructed walls she had built around herself for all those years crumbled into dust. Tears streamed down her face, silent at first, then turning into deep, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. She started talking, the words tumbling out in a broken, half-coherent stream. She told me a version of the truth, a carefully edited story designed to protect someone, maybe me, maybe herself. She said Daniel, Eli, was her brother, her younger brother. She said he had been troubled, that he'd gotten into a fight, that something terrible had happened. She talked about shame, guilt, a bad decision she'd made one night that she could never take back. My dad sat beside her, a stone statue, his face unreadable. He didn't comfort her, he just listened, his jaw so tight I thought it might crack. Her story was full of holes, contradictions, things that didn't add up. But through the tears and the half-truths, one thing became clear. Daniel wasn't just missing. The family, the whole town, thought he was dead. But my mom knew something they didn't. She confessed she had kept a secret about the night he vanished. It was about the fight Mrs. Lopez had mentioned. She revealed there was someone else there that night, another person involved. This wasn't just about a lost brother anymore. This was about a buried crime. Everything I thought I knew, the imaginary friend, the quiet ghost in the backyard, was reframed. It was a memory, a piece of a hidden trauma trying to surface through me. As her sobs subsided into exhausted sniffles, she looked at me, her eyes red and pleading. "There's one more thing," she whispered, her voice raw. "I promised I'd never tell you. I promised because it would ruin you." What promise? What could possibly be more ruinous than everything she had just confessed? If your parent confessed a deep, dark secret that could damage your family's name forever, would you want to know the rest of it? Or would you tell them to keep it buried? Let me know in the comments. The silence that followed her words stretched for what felt like an eternity. My dad finally moved, standing up and walking over to the window, turning his back on us. That was my answer. He didn't want the rest of the story to be told, but I had to know. I looked at my mom, my expression unwavering. She took a deep, shaky breath and told me the hard truth. It wasn't a horror movie story of monsters and villains. It was messier, more human, and in some ways, more heartbreaking. Daniel hadn't been her brother. He had been her first love, the boy from the wrong side of the tracks that her parents had forbidden her from seeing. The person she had the fight with that night wasn't a stranger. It was her father, my grandfather. He had found them together by the oak tree. There had been an argument, shouting, a terrible struggle. Daniel had fallen, hit his head on a rock at the base of the tree. My grandfather, a man with a reputation to protect and a violent temper, panicked. He told my mother that Daniel had run off, that he'd scared him away for good. He made her promise to never speak of him again. He convinced her it was for the best, that the boy was trouble and she was better off. My mom, young and terrified, agreed. She buried the tin box that night, a secret memorial to the boy she thought had just been forced to leave town. She didn't know he was gone forever. It wasn't until years later, when my grandfather was on his deathbed, that he confessed the truth. Daniel hadn't run away. He had died that night, and my grandfather had buried him somewhere no one would ever find him. He made my mother swear on his life that she would never tell anyone, to protect the family name, to protect her. I had to sit down. The image I'd held of my mother my whole life, a quiet, gentle, slightly sad woman, shattered and rearranged itself into something new, something cracked and complex. She wasn't just a grieving sister. She was a girl who had been manipulated, who had been a party to a terrible secret, a victim of her own father's crime. The imaginary friend, Eli, Daniel, he wasn't a ghost trying to haunt her. He was a memory, trying to tell me the truth she was too scared to voice. He was trying to solve his own murder. As if on cue, my dad finally spoke, his voice heavy. He said there had been a police report filed back then, a missing person case that was quietly closed after a few weeks. He said my grandfather had friends in high places. He pulled out a box from his desk, a box I now realized held more than just old bills. Inside was a single piece of paper, a carbon copy of an old police note. It was a statement from a neighbor who reported hearing a fight, but later retracted it. Tucked with it was a partial letter, an apology my grandfather had started to write to my mother, but never finished. The pieces were all there. Daniel's disappearance wasn't an accident or a runaway story. It was a cover-up. And just as that realization sunk in, solid and cold in the pit of my stomach, I saw something on the floor by the front door. A piece of white paper had been slipped under the mail slot. I picked it up. On it, in blocky, printed letters, were 2 words, "Stop digging," and underneath, a single, shaky initial, D. Someone, or something, was still watching. Have you ever been warned to stop asking questions? Did you stop or did you press on? Tell me your story. The note changed the atmosphere from one of historical grief to one of present danger. Was it a prank, a threat from someone else who knew the story? Or was it him, a final warning from the other side? We never found out for sure. My choice in that moment was clear. The secret had poisoned my family for a generation. My mother had lived her whole life under the weight of it. My father had enabled her silence out of a misguided sense of protection. Letting it stay buried wasn't an option anymore. We didn't go to the police. The trail was too cold, the key players gone. Exposing the truth would only bring a media circus to our door and destroy my mother in a way that felt like a second punishment. So I chose a different path: forgiveness and memory. We stopped talking about it in terms of a secret. We started talking about Daniel. My mom told me stories about him, filling in the colors of the boy in the faded Polaroid. She told me about his crooked smile, about his love for old cars, about the way he could make her laugh even when her father was at his worst. We were excavating a life, not just a death. It was a slow, painful process, like setting a bone that had healed wrong. Some days were full of tears. Other days, we managed a small, sad smile. The house started to feel lighter. Years went by. I moved out, started my own life, but the story was always there, a quiet part of who I was. One day, when I was back at my parents' house helping them clean out the garage, I found a box of old cassette tapes. They were mostly old music mixes from the 80s, but one was unlabeled. Curious, I took it home and found an old Walkman to play it on. I pressed play, and after a few seconds of hiss, a voice came through the headphones. It was a young man's voice, low and a little rough, like gravel in a can. It was his voice. He was talking to my mom, recording a message for her on a cheap tape recorder. It must have been from the day he died. He was telling her not to worry, that he had a plan for them to leave together, to start over somewhere new. He talked about the future, about the life they were going to have. And then, at the very end of the tape, his voice changed. It became quiet, intimate, as if he was whispering a secret just for me across all those years. He said, "And if we ever have a kid, I hope she's got your eyes. I hope she's strong enough to hear the stories that are hard to tell." He paused, and then he said my name, my actual name. He said it clear as day, and then he finished with, "Tell her to live. Tell her not to carry my shame for me." The tape clicked off. He wasn't a ghost trying to solve a crime. He wasn't a spirit looking for revenge. He was a memory reaching through time, not to cause trouble, but to give my mother and me permission to be free. He had come to me as a kid, not to haunt me, but to comfort me, to let me know the story before I was old enough to understand the weight of it. He was a protective presence, the imaginary friend I always knew he was. So, what do you think? Was he an imaginary friend, a ghost, or was he a memory, a story trying to find its way out into the light? Drop your take below. I really, truly need to know if I'm alone on this. Sometimes, even now, when I'm sitting in my living room late at night, I'll hear a gentle tapping on the window pane. Just a quiet, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. I never see anyone there. It's probably just a branch from the tree outside. Probably. Was this a ghost story, a family secret, or something else entirely? Something in between? Tell me your theory. The best, most interesting comment gets a shout out in my next video. I'll be reading them all.